on the Learning Channel.
The complete story of Genghis Khan and his quest to dominate Europe and Asia. The Mongol hordes, a storm from the east, premiering next.
Years ago, Europe awoke to a terrible army which suddenly appeared out of the eastern mists. Very little was known about this army, except that it was terrifying, known to annihilate everything and everyone who stood in its path. These were the Mongols, the Tartars, the Devil's Horsemen.
Save us, O Lord, from the wrath of the Tartars.
The call went out for the defense of Christendom.
To Germany, ardent at war, to France, who nurses an undaunted soldiery, to Spain, to England, mighty with warriors and ships, to Sicily, to Ireland, to frozen Norway.
But to no avail. Across Poland and Hungary, entire armies were put to the sword. It seemed nothing, not even prayer, could stop the invaders from sweeping right through Europe to the sea. The church, convinced that Armageddon had arrived, preached that the invaders were none other than the children of Gog and Magog, the tormentor of Satan, sent to punish a sinful world. To others, it seemed that God himself had deserted them. This was the end of everything, of time itself. This scatter of stones on the steppes of Mongolia is all that is left of Karakorum, once the capital of the greatest land empire. For a few decades during the 13th century, this was the most important city in the world. Ambassadors and envoys were summoned here from as far afield as Kaifeng, Baghdad, Moscow, and Lyon to pay tribute to the great Khan. And it was here that the Mongol rulers governed an empire that stretched for more than 5,000 miles, from the Pacific to the Danube. Today, Mongolia is retracing its glory days, emerging from 70 years of isolation imposed by a communist regime. During this century, the heroes of the past were dismissed as irrelevant and replaced by more contemporary idols, men like Suke Bator, a contemporary of Lenin. But with Glasnost and all that has followed, Mongolians began to rediscover and celebrate the heroes of their distant past. The figure that stands at the heart of this renaissance is the Mongolian once and future king, Genghis Khan. His deeds have been turned into folklore. The man himself has the status of a god. Genghis Khan is now regarded as the father of the nation, the focus of resurgent Mongolian nationalism. His spirit is destined, they say, to return and lead the country to another era of greatness. But to the rest of the world, the name of Genghis Khan is still synonymous with the rape of civilization. Though history also shows him to have been a leader of genius, and he could hardly have been that simply on the basis of terror, the truth is difficult to unravel. Many of the early accounts of the man were written by his enemies. The first Mongolian chronicle, the famous Secret History, was written after his death, and not surprisingly contains a mixture of fact and fantasy. It uses myth to describe the genesis of the Mongol people near the shores of Lake Baikal in the heart of Central Asia.
There was once a blue wolf whose destiny had been wrought from heaven, and who took as his mate a fallow deer. Passing over the waters of the sea, they camped at the head of the Onon River, where Batassian was born, near the foot of Mount Birken Khaldun.
According to the Secret History, the descendants of the Blue Wolf, Batassian and his family, were the tribe of nomadic people that became known as the Mongols. By the 12th century, the Mongols had settled in a remote plateau in Central Asia. They were one of a half-dozen similar nomadic tribes with now forgotten names: the Kerids, the Merkids, the Naimans, the Onghuts, and the Khitans. The lives of the steppe nomads have always been governed by the need to find pasture for their flocks. But the nomads are also dependent on the horse, which was first domesticated in southern Russia between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago. The steppe nomads learned to exploit the horse's remarkable speed and stamina. It's not surprising, then, that they were not just herdsmen, but great hunters. The summer pastures sustain vast herds, but the winters always tested both man and beast. Life is noted by the seasons. In the summer, when the temperature reaches 100 degrees or more, the steppe nomads migrate with their flocks up into the cool highlands. In the winter, when the temperature reaches 30 below zero for months at a time, they return to the sheltering valleys. The lakes and rivers freeze for up to 6 months a year. Generations of nomads have had to cut and cart great slabs of ice back to their camps for drinking water. The steppe nomads live in tents known as yurts or gurs. Made of felt and stretched across a wooden frame, they can be dismantled and loaded up onto ox carts in less than an hour. In this bleak environment, life is stripped of all but the bare necessities. The fuel? Dried animal dung. The steppe has no wood. As they did 800 years ago, the people feed on mutton. Almost every part of the sheep is eaten or used. The Mongols did not make pots nor metal. They didn't even weave cloth. They never cultivated the land, nor kept pigs or chickens. They did nothing to impede their ability to simply pack up and move on to new pastures. Life was a timeless battle with their environment, and was mirrored in the struggles to defend good grazing land against their neighbors. Murder and tribal wars were commonplace. But 800 years ago, from these uncompromising conditions, there emerged the figure of Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan. The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, will return.
We're hoping that by replacing her knee, we will return her to normal function.
Now continues. Clues to the secret history suggest that Temujin was born in 1167 near Mount Burkhan Khaldun in eastern Mongolia. His father, a local chieftain, was murdered by a rival tribe. Temujin and his family were abandoned. From the age of 13, he vowed to avenge his father's death and retake his birthright. The early part of his story tells of important friendships and alliances, but after a series of betrayals, his private struggle turns into a campaign for absolute supremacy. For more than 15 years, Temujin and his followers waged war against one tribe after another. After each victory, supporters would flock to his cause, only to retreat again at the next setback. Such fickleness persuaded Temujin that he could rely on no one but himself and his immediate followers. Those that stood by him were fiercely loyal. They realized soon enough that Temujin commanded military brilliance. It was also clear that he was driven both by a thirst for conquest and a personal revenge against those that had betrayed him. Over time, the victories grew. Finally, in 1204, in a great battle against an entire group of remaining tribes, Temujin declared victory. Later, Temujin was officially proclaimed ruler of all the steppe nomads and invested with the title Genghis Khan. As he surveyed his army, Genghis knew that victory was hollow unless he could impose some kind of nationhood on the disparate tribes. First, he had to destroy old loyalties and demand allegiance to him and him alone. He did this by removing traditional commanders of tribal armies and replacing them with his own. He made sure he was the only target of the new army's loyalty. For the first time in centuries, the nomadic tribes were united under a single standard, the Nine Tails. The new Mongol nation under Genghis Khan embraced all the eastern steppes. Its territory lay between two immensely wealthy civilizations, China to the south and east, and the Islamic Empire of the Khoresm Shah to the west. Though neither of these two empires posed an immediate threat, Genghis was not the trusting type, nor one to assume the best. He set about transforming his army into a most formidable force. He concentrated on developing the skills of his cavalry. He began by taking the Mongols' favorite sport, hunting, and turning it into a military exercise. Thousands of men were deployed in long, continuous lines that stretched for miles across the countryside. They would then sweep forward, driving before them all the animals in their path. Other units would be positioned at prearranged points around what would later become the killing ground. Each soldier was taught absolute obedience, to learn his place in the line, to hold that place no matter what, and to think and act as part of a larger entity. Once the quarry had been flushed out, the riders surrounded it, preventing its escape. No one was ever allowed to kill until the Khan gave his command. Then, it was an opportunity for the soldiers to show off their individual skills. From these exercises emerged remarkable discipline and organization. Genghis structured his army on a decimal system, starting with a tumen, roughly 10,000 men, to units of 1,000, then 100, and finally down to basic patrols of 10 men, known as arban. Each unit commander, from patrol leader up to general, was chosen because he was the best man for the job. Most other armies of the time were led by hereditary nobles and princes. The size of their armies reflected their personal wealth, not their skills as commanders. Not so with the Mongols. Their leaders had all come up through the ranks, men who had proved their ability and loyalty in the field. The entire army was a tightly knit organization of tens of thousands of disciplined men. Each soldier was required to keep 4 or 5 horses, a scimitar, shield, lance, 2 bows, and a quiver of 60 arrows. He had to be ready to move at a moment's notice for a journey of hundreds of miles. In his saddlebags, he had to carry cooking pots, dried meat, a water bottle, files for sharpening arrows, and even a needle and thread. By 1207, this fully equipped and disciplined fighting force was ready. Genghis knew that if he were to retain the army's loyalty at home, he would have to provide it with military success and raid civilized lands beyond the frontier. That meant China. For centuries before Genghis Khan, nomadic raiders had swept down from the steppes to attack the towns and cities on the plains of northern China. To keep the barbarians out, the Chinese had built up a series of walls. Some centuries later, these walls were linked together to form the Great Wall. Despite their proximity, the two societies held each other in mutual contempt. To the Chinese, the nomads were the terrible uncooked, while to the Mongols, China had an irresistible source of gold and silks, goods worthy of plunder. China in the 13th century was divided into 3 separate kingdoms. The real heart of China lay in the south, ruled for hundreds of years by a dynasty known as the Sung. To the north lay the Qin Empire, governed by the Manchurian dynasty. To the west was Xixia. Easily the weakest of the 3, this dynasty had yet to be conquered. This is where Genghis made his first raid onto foreign territory in 1207. It was the Mongols' first encounter with a civilization which built cities, fortifications, and huge monuments. Although the kingdom was not yet conquered, after 2 years of raids, Genghis had extorted a vast amount of loot from this rich and opulent kingdom. Genghis also extracted a promise from the king that he would provide troops to assist the Mongols in future campaigns, whenever the need arose. Satisfied, Genghis withdrew from Xixia and decided to turn his attention further east, toward the Qin. The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, will return, now continues. The Qin were far more experienced at dealing with nomadic invaders. The northern highlands had always been their first line of defense. The Qin kept close guard on the passes. But the Mongols had planned carefully. By 1211, after several sharp engagements, they overran the mountain garrisons. They hoped the way was now open into the fertile plains. But the Qin were not about to surrender that easily. Across their empire, the alarm drums sounded. The drums were the way of inspiring, almost hypnotizing the Qin defenders. By the summer, the Mongols finally confronted the Qin army. Though heavily outnumbered, Genghis decided to attack. In a devastating display of mobility and discipline, Genghis's mounted archers showered arrows into the Qin ranks. Totally demoralized, the Qin army then faced a shattering charge of the Mongol heavy cavalry. Within a few hours, the Mongols had destroyed an army of 70,000 men. When the terrible news reached the capital, the Qin commanders retreated behind their fortified walls. They thought they were safe here. They knew the Mongols did not have the equipment or the training to breach their defenses. Genghis had to admit that they were right for the time being, but he vowed to return. If the Qin walls and cities were strange, incomprehensible to Mongol eyes, so too was the fertile countryside, peopled by millions of peasants. They wondered about the well-ordered terracing, at the irrigation canals, at the farms and villages. What the Mongols didn't understand, they despised, and what they despised, they destroyed. Over the next few years, hundreds of thousands of Chinese peasants were slaughtered. By the time Genghis's armies returned to attack the capital in 1214, they were equipped with rudimentary siege machines. The Mongols isolated the city for almost a year, condemning the citizens to appalling deprivations. In 1215, the capital finally surrendered, and the Mongols entered unopposed. Once inside the walls, the alien sights and sounds of the city perplexed and aggravated the Mongols. For once, discipline broke down. The soldiers ran amok. They rode up and down the narrow streets, setting everything ablaze. Tens of thousands were slaughtered in a frenzy of uncontrolled butchery. A visiting ambassador reported that when the fires were put out, the city was littered with corpses, and the streets were greasy with human fat. But Genghis Khan was not there to see the slaughter. He was already preoccupied by events far off to the west. In 1218, a caravan of Mongol merchants traveling to the great western empire of the Khoresm Shah were stopped and then executed as spies. Genghis sent an envoy to demand an explanation. When the envoy was executed, Genghis Khan grew furious. Revenge was inevitable. The Khoresm Shah's empire was fabulously wealthy, especially the cities, which lay in the Great Silk Road from China to the Middle East. The greatest of these cities was the capital, Samarkand, which the Khoresm Shah built into an opulent pleasure palace. Here lived Chinese and Persian artisans who wove silk, worked leather, produced silver lame, wove carpets, and even forged an early type of steel. It was a lively, cosmopolitan society. The Khoresm Shah himself was a vain creature, fated by his courtiers as the second Alexander the Great. He believed their flattery and was confident he could handle the arrogant barbarian called Genghis Khan. Genghis took his time. Indeed, he took a year to prepare for the campaign. He withdrew his army from China, summoned men from every corner of the steppe, and put together the greatest concentration of Mongol power ever seen. Estimates put the Mongol army at about 150,000, but it was probably less than half the size of Khoresm Shah's forces. Before setting out, Genghis sent word to the king of Shishia, calling on his promise to provide troops whenever needed. But the king replied that if Genghis didn't have enough men, then he didn't deserve to be the great Khan. As Genghis turned his army west, he resolved one day to avenge this insult. The Mongols faced a march of more than 1,500 miles toward their goal, the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand. Their spies had told them that the Khoresm Shah had deployed his defenses along the Sir Darya River, the empire's frontier. Genghis divided his army into 4 separate divisions, 3 of which attacked the frontier at several points at once. The 4th and largest contingent, led by Genghis himself, crossed the Sir Darya River and then promptly disappeared. Instead of turning south toward the enemy lines, Genghis led his army due west, straight into the Kizilkum Desert. The Kizilkum was impenetrable. There were no known waterholes, no roads, no landmarks. But Genghis had a guide who knew a route through the wasteland. For months, his contingent made its way secretly across the sands. Then, in March 1218, as the defending armies used their strength against the other Mongol attacks, Genghis suddenly emerged over 400 miles behind enemy lines, outside the walls of Bukhara. Military historians still point to it as one of the most dramatic outflanking movements in the history of warfare. Panic swept through the city, and shortly afterwards, the Bukhara garrison abandoned their posts. Once inside, Genghis and his men galloped into what they imagined was a palace and rode through the cloisters. When he learned that he was inside a mosque, he ordered it converted into stables. Copies of the Koran were thrown to the four winds, and the boxes that had held them were used as mangers. Then Genghis mounted the pulpit to berate the citizens about the treachery of their sultan and to list reasons for his victory.
I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, he would not have sent a punishment like me.
Terrified by the accounts of massacres in China, the citizens awaited their fate. Unlike that city in China, the sacking of Bukhara was disciplined and controlled. Beneath this very minaret, thousands of people were executed as a deliberate warning to others to immediately submit. The city was stripped of its treasures and a tax extracted from the wealthy families. Most of the women and children were herded off to Mongolia. Then the city walls were systematically destroyed, and refugees dispatched to spread the news that Bukhara had fallen. Genghis Khan proved to be a master of psychological warfare. A large segment of the male population was then herded out in front of his army. With this human shield, Genghis marched on Samarkand. The Mongol horde now continues. From behind these very walls, the citizens of Samarkand watched for this dust cloud of approaching Mongols. The Khoresm Shah had already abandoned them. He had fled westward a few days earlier. The Mongols put to the torch that part of the city that lay outside its walls, and Samarkand surrendered within 5 days. Within just a few months, the Mongols had smashed one of the largest empires in the world. But there was still a personal score to settle. To seek out the escaped Khoresm Shah, one of Genghis Khan's finest generals, Subedai, was sent to the west. Genghis himself turned toward Afghanistan in pursuit of the Sultan's son and the remnants of the empire's army. To the Mongols, this was a strange and alien land. They knew of it only from stories told by nomadic wanderers like these, who had journeyed between China and Afghanistan for centuries. A 1,000 years before Christ, Zarathustra had preached to his followers here. 700 years later, Alexander marched his army through these hills. Now came Genghis Khan. The cities of these parts were some of the oldest known to man and among the wealthiest. Places like Merv, Nishapur, Tus, Herat, Balkh. Genghis Khan and his army had only once before seen cities like these, and that was thousands of miles away in China. From Samarkand all the way to the Indus River, almost everything they came across was a revelation. A bewildering experience for a people who traveled only with what they could carry on their horses and who lived in felt tents. Genghis Khan determined that in the future, his people would live their lives as richly endowed as these people. Glassware, silks, pottery, carpets, tapestries, gold, silverware. These were the trappings of the cities that had for centuries set their inhabitants apart from the nomads. These things would now adorn the inside of the Mongols' tents. They were loaded up and taken back across the steppes in massive caravans. More importantly, the Mongols sent back to their homeland all of the artisan families who produced these works. Alongside them marched clerics, physicians, mystics, and poets. From the great city of Gurganj, chroniclers claimed 100,000 artisans were deported. The story was repeated everywhere. It was one of the greatest enforced migrations in history. The tools, raw materials, and all the skills of the great cities were transplanted to the empty grasslands of Central Asia. This was more than just a plunder. Genghis was laying down the foundation of an empire. The most highly prized of the city dwellers were the metalworkers and engineers, the people who would build and update the Mongol war machinery. They would forge scimitars, design catapults and ballistas, and all the other siege machines the Mongols would deploy in future campaigns. Suddenly, a people who had known little more than herding and hunting now had in their employ some of the finest toolmakers, metalworkers, and artisans in the world. But Genghis Khan had not embarked on this campaign simply to enrich his domain. His first priority was still revenge. Ordered the slaughter of the entire population. He unleashed a terror that had no precedent. Just as in China, those who suffered most were the peasants who worked the land. To a people who had never grown anything themselves, the connection between fertility and prosperity was something they just didn't understand. Peasants were worthless. Thousands were slaughtered. The Mongol hordes, stormed from the east, will return.
Take one famous Chinese chef, add a generous helping of Southern hospitality, stir in just a hint of French cuisine for that international flavor, and season with one of Canada's most popular cooking experts. And voila, it's the perfect recipe for a perfect afternoon. Find out for yourself why America's really cooking with Martin Yan, Natalie Dupree, Pierre Frenet, and James Barber. Today, beginning at 5 on the Learning Channel.
You know, our competitor is twice as likely to have a network outage. If you're trusting your important 800 calls to them, well...
Now continues. The cities suffered almost as badly. These are the foundations of a citadel built by Alexander the Great at Herat in western Afghanistan. Part of it has been recently restored. After the Mongols had stormed the citadel above, parts of which have recently been restored, they butchered almost the entire population. News of this and other massacres spread like shockwaves through other cities as a warning that anything other than complete submission would cost them dearly. Psychological warfare, and it worked. From then on, for every city that was wiped out, many others surrendered and were left unharmed. Still, the roll call of devastation was numbing. Persian chroniclers claimed nearly 2.5 million died at Herat. At Naishapur, the chroniclers put the figure at 2 million. None of these figures can be taken literally, but they do indicate the enormous psychological impact the Mongol invasion had on this corner of the Islamic world. The cold and deliberate slaughter of entire populations had no precedent in history. At Balkh, once a jewel of mosques and universities, nothing remains but the walls. Here at Tus, even the walls have crumbled. Eventually, Genghis grew tired of the campaign, and at the shores of the Indus River, turned his army around and headed home. He was 55 and aware of his own mortality. But away in the desert, his general Subadai was still far from finished with war. He had pursued the Khoresm Shah for nearly 500 miles, but the Sultan died before Subadai could get to him. So with reinforcements, he took the long way home. He rode across to the Black Sea and the Ukraine. Finally, he struck eastward across an unsuspecting Russia. Subadai's raid took him from the open steppes to the forests, from searing summers to icebound winters. In 2.5 years, he and his men rode 5,500 miles. It was one of the greatest achievements in mobile warfare. It was also a reconnaissance mission to gauge the power of the enemy. On the long ride east, homeward, Subadai decided that the Mongols would be back. To the devastated Russians, the Mongol whirlwind had been incomprehensible. A chronicler wrote,
"For our sins, unknown tribes came, whom no one exactly knows who they are, nor whence they came out, nor what their language is, nor of what race they are, nor what their faith is."
Congregations begged the Lord to spare them from any further degradations by the devil's horsemen. After 6 years of campaigning, the Mongol armies returned, having defeated every opponent they had encountered. Just 30 years before, they were an anonymous tribe of nomadic herdsmen, and now they were indisputably the greatest military force anywhere in Asia. In recognition and fear of Genghis Khan's reputation, Korea and Tibet, and other lands too, offered their submission and tribute to the new world conqueror. But Genghis still had unfinished business. This was the kingdom of Shishia in western China. 7 years earlier, before his campaign against the Khoresm Shah, Genghis had called upon the king to fulfill his promise to provide him with troops, and had been refused. 7 years later, Genghis would take his revenge. By the time the Mongols departed, all that remained of Shishia is this burial ground of its kings. Their once great civilization was buried too, and the remains of the last king were scattered to the four winds. This would be the last of Genghis's campaigns. Although he never doubted the outcome, he did not live to see it finished. The creator of the world's greatest cavalry died in August 1227 after a fall from his horse. He left behind an empire already twice the size of Alexander the Great's. It was inevitable that the life and death of a man like Genghis would soon be shrouded in myth. And so it was. No sooner had he gone than it was declared that all his accomplishments had been preordained. According to the secret history, a bird of prey had come down to Genghis from heaven with a message from the Mongol god Tengri. This message was interpreted by the shamans that danced at the Mongol court.
God spoke to me, saying, "I have given the whole earth to Temujin and his sons, and I have named him Genghis Khan."
Tengri, or the blue heavenly sky god, had granted the Genghis dynasty and the Mongol people a mandate to rule the world. That would be the purpose and the meaning of the Mongol Empire.
The empire grows under descendants of Genghis Khan, as TLC brings you part 2 of The Mongol Hordes, A Storm from the East, next.